Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we're going to be talking about survey research. There's going to be a little bit of an overlap, or I'll say a reinforcement from the lecture on measurement. So if some of the concepts seem a little familiar, that's good because it means that you're learning something. And it'll be, just a little bit easier. We'll um, address some of the same ideas, but at the same time, we'll go into a little bit more detail about how we implement these measurements and how we implement these in the context of doing a survey. So let's begin. So one of the reasons why we use surveys is because we can gather a lot of different types of data with them in a very efficient way. And if you get a wide enough population with enough different people in that population, then and with a large sample size, then you're actually going to be able to make some generalizable conclusions from the survey. So you will be able to make some possible claims. Now, there can be errors, such as errors of observation. So this would have to do with the study itself, where maybe you've got some poorly written questions, or the way that the questions are presented, if they're done in kind of a haphazard manner. Or then non-observation questions where maybe it would be you don't it's all white people and you're trying to get diverse perspectives, or you're looking to understand issues of gender equality and gender equity, but you're only asking men. So so you may have inadequate coverage of the population. It could be like a non-response if people don't respond, or if they say, I don't know. If you give that as a response, that is a type of response, and there actually can be information behind that. But it can be lead to errors of observation if you just discount it. So there can definitely be some issues there, and some of the random sampling can potentially lead to some errors as well in who takes the survey. So we need to be mindful of those errors and try and mitigate those as best as possible. When we are designing some of the questionnaires, we want to make sure that there's a consistent focus throughout it. The last thing you want to do is have a questionnaire that is too long, because then people are going to drop out. You want to use existing instruments that have been validated as best you can. If there's an instrument out there and you already know that it works well, then it's good to use it, as opposed to one that has not been tested, unless that's the intention, is to test it. The order of the questions makes a difference, so a lot of them, especially when we're adding in, interpretive questions, how do people understand these? The layout even makes an impact. So there's a little bit of an art in how we design this questionnaire. Are we paying people? Maybe having multiple reminders to increase our sample size. So, there's a lot of different things that can go on to make a good questionnaire. When we write the question specifically, uh, as I said, we want to have good ones. So having clear questions or clear statements that people are indicating, their degree of affiliation with, or endorsement of, you would say. So that's really important. And I mean, that is a science in and of, and an art unto itself. So, just continually refining, making sure that your questions are clear, and especially that they are clear in the same way and they mean the same thing to different populations, because people, may have their own different contexts and it may not actually work. They may interpret it differently depending on the language that's used and where they're coming from. So that is really important. Closed-ended versus open-ended questions, we'll talk a little bit about those. Um, And the different types of response categories, are they mutually exclusive? Can people pick more than one? Uh, Great example here is around racial identity. Well, there's plenty of people who hold multiple racial identities, except, a lot of times it's pick one, and you have to ascribe yourself as either white or Asian or Native American. So there's yeah, a lot of issues there. So needing to have sufficient response categories. We can use matrix questions, and we also want to be mindful of sensitive subjects. Sometimes people don't want to answer questions because they may not feel comfortable. And if they don't feel comfortable, are they going to simply drop out of the whole survey? Or do we let them skip that particular question and then keep going on? In which case, then some data is better than nothing. Other issues, we want to kind of avoid some of the confusing phrasing or vagueness, be very specific. Sometimes it can be helpful to provide a frame of reference, but on the other hand, sometimes, it's you're defining it for them, and we want them to kind of define it openly for themselves. We want to avoid, kind of double negatives or negative words. So that way everything is kind of asking a question in the same way. And like you have all these statements that are always leading, in the same direction. Um, Sometimes you have to like then do a reverse scoring if you understand that it's like, well, um, if a statement, kind of ends up moving positive and that's a higher, but then you've got another one that's written negatively, is that a higher or a lower, and how does that align up with the person? And then if you have, this idea of a double-barreled question, where you're asking two questions, really, you ask a question and then you ask a follow-up question. So the person's like, well, I answered yes to this one, but no to that one. How do I answer? So we want to avoid those, and reducing, jargon and um, these types of things, and memory questions, asking people to recall times or frequency of times if they haven't actually recorded it. There can be some problems there. Now, I mentioned, closed-ended and open-ended questions. We've talked about that in class. So an example is of a closed-ended question would be, do you smoke 7 or more cigarettes per week? Yes or no? Okay, you've got two options. And it's a very clear question. And so you offer the categories that people can choose from. And, there's no variation from there. And you're like, well, it depends sometimes. I mean, you might be able to build in some of that, but it would still be um, a, uh, a closed-ended question, as opposed to where the respondents provide their own response. How does smoking make you feel emotionally? It makes me feel less anxious, but then after the nicotine wears off, then I get more anxious. Who knows? So you're providing them an open box. Now, one of the things that I have noticed in some of the survey software is that you don't want too many open-ended questions, because then they have writing fatigue. So it's much easier if it's just going click, 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 as opposed to writing out whole sentences. Other issues with some of these response categories, you want to, kind of look for, bias that could be in them, such as, was this helpful? Did you find this harmful? Those are leading questions that will help, will guide and influence how people respond. The social desirability, and so, people want to be desired, and um, to appear favorable and want to agree with you. So, there is that issue there. Sometimes having, like a out of the scale of 1 to 5 is not so good. We want to have people either decide, yeah, I'm more negative, or I'm more positive, as opposed to what we call a fence sitter. And so like they want that neutral option. They want the three. Um, and so, it's better sometimes to have that even number where they have to pick to one degree or the other. So you would say scale of 1 to 6, from 1 horrible to 6 wonderful, things like that. Um, and then you've got these floaters where they're like, I don't know. But there is actually can be some information in that. So we want to minimize the number of questions that have either a don't know option or an opt out option or a neutral in the middle option. Then there are, other issues where um, filter questions. So if they ask, if they say yes on a certain scale, then additional questions open up. But otherwise, then they don't get asked those questions if they did not answer yes. So it won't drill down if it's not appropriate for them. And so, using these Likert type response categories, such as on that scale of 1 to 6, 1 being horrible, 6 being wonderful, how do you feel about it? So those are really, really helpful. One of the ways in which those are arranged is through matrix questions, where you've got a series of questions under a common theme, and you're using that Likert type scale. Um, Now, unfortunately, people don't may not necessarily read each question. They just go like straight down, and when in doubt, pick C. And so they'll just pick C for all of them, if you will. Um, so, you want to also, when you're doing sensitive topics, you want to kind of create, just a supportiveness and neutralness as well as we're able to. So an example of a matrix question, this is from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Financial Wellbeing Scale. How well does this statement describe you or your situation? And so we've got, a list of 3, and I've actually just, taken a small snapshot here. There's the short one has 5 questions, the long one has 10, but here we've just got 3. But you can see it's listing them out, and then you can kind of check or just go straight down uh, whichever you like. And so the statement describes me. And so the person may say, because of my money situation, I feel like I'll never have the things I want in life. That completely describes me. And I'm just getting by financially. Ugh, that completely describes me. I'm concerned that the money I have or will save won't last. Ugh, that completely describes me. One of the problems actually here is that these are all very negative questions. Now, interestingly, um, if that's kind of what we're looking at, fine. But one of the things that we found was that this short form was more negative and had more negative questions than the full long form. And so people were scoring a little bit worse there. Now, also, between cultures, some cultures and some people are just more positive. And so this was not necessarily working as well for other people. And so one of the things that we would want to do in improving this is to or to hold cognitive interviews, to ask people really to think about out loud how they would answer this question. Um, to help us understand how people see these questions differently and how we can account for some of the different cultural interpretations, um, because it doesn't work the same across cognitive interviews or across different scales and different populations. Then you've got, behavior coding, and so you're looking at, you hold several of these interviews, identify some of the behaviors that come up, and so we code those using our qualitative methods. Um, and it is really, really important to hold a pilot study. So, maybe do your survey with 5 people or 7 people, and let them know that they're going to be doing the survey, but really kind of and let them know that this is a pilot. And so have them go through and have them identify problems with it. So that way you can improve it before you give it to everybody. This is really, really important. This is like submitting a paper and getting some peer review feedback. It's like giving your paper to a professor, having them grade it, having them point out some of the things that needs improvement before you send it out for publication. That's just good practice because you stop seeing things and so stuff that you've been reading, you feel like, hey, this makes total sense. I know what I mean, but does it come across to others in the same way? And so having that feedback from others becomes really, really, really important because you yourself cannot see it. So having that pilot study is a really important piece. Next, um, when we talk, think about the survey design, how we deliver it, how we administer it, is really important to consider. Are we doing it by mail, by email, by phone, in person? Is it being sent out on social media? How are people receiving it? How often should we deliver it? So, who delivers it? Is it being done in a clinical office where the clinician is giving this survey and the person is responding, or are they doing it themselves? So, one of the things, if we go back to that financial well-being scale, for those of you who have done it, it will ask, did somebody read this to you, or did you do it yourself? That is actually a really important question that has to do with this setting because that can actually influence the score. And they know that. So that hence they're asking that question. And so there's a different scale that's used to come up with the score based on if you did it yourself or if somebody gave it to you. The structure is also very important. As I mentioned earlier, are there lots of open-ended questions? Is there an interview guide so that way the person who maybe the person who's administering it knows some background information of how to do it? Is it presented in one long sheet, or is it one question, then another question, then another question? Do you have a little bar at the top of the screen that indicates, what percentage done are you? These types of things. Are there, some of those follow-up questions if you answered yes? So those are things to address, and it can be expensive or it can be relatively cheaper, depending on how you go about doing this survey. So are you delivering it to a company and that company has access to a panel of folks who are on-call survey takers, so official survey takers. Uh, and so, are you able to, get a large amount of data there, in which case maybe you have to pay some money up front? Or are you going to insert a question or two into somebody else's survey, in which case you might need to pay a little bit of money up front? Are you providing incentives? So are you giving, maybe offering a gift card, so maybe a $5 gift card for people to take the survey, or are you giving them the chance to win a $100 gift card, but there would only be, $200 gift cards, in which case then, it's what I find personally is that I would be more inclined to receive the $5 that I know I'm going to receive rather than a slight chance at 100 because it's kind of like a bird in hand versus, however many in the tree. You can have 1,000 birds in the tree. It doesn't mean I'm going to get any of them versus, having that $5. So there's a whole psychology to how people go about and take surveys. That's really important. And, whole books that have been read and written about how to design surveys. So as I mentioned, you can mail them, you can maybe administer them in a group, you can do them in a telephone or in person, in the clinical office, maybe electronic surveys if you're going out for the community or sending them out by email. Uh, or, there can be mixed mode surveys. So the different ways of going about it. Maybe there's both an interview and a formal structured set of questions. So there's different ways of going about it depending on what your needs are and who you're trying to reach. So one of the things that is really important here that has to do with how different people will respond to questions or statements differently has to do with then the interpretation and translating of the statement from one language to another. And so we need to recognize that there's, certain words may not translate or certain ideas may not translate literally. So there's a whole kind of range of different linguistic considerations that you need to keep in mind. So that has to do with the content, semantic, technical, criterion, and conceptual that you see there. And that's, the details there are in your book. Um, and if there's a person interviewing, that person, based on their race or their gender, or their ethnicity, if it's different or if it's the same as the respondent, that's going to also impact how the person responds. So just simply being present and knowing that there's something going on will influence the outcome. So we need to be really, really mindful of how we bring ourselves, how we present ourselves, who is being presented, do they speak the language fluently, um, and is the survey, excuse me, in line with everything that, how they are going to be understanding it, especially if it's been translated into a different language. Some of the implications here is that, if we have some cross-sectional surveys, this can be really helpful for developing evidence-based practices and understanding, what's the impact, what's the effect, are people happy with the service, are they benefiting from it? And so, that can be, good at a specific moment. If you have, multiple surveys that do over the course of a longer period, you can kind of string them together, and so individually, there would be a cross section, but then it would actually become then a longitudinal version. And so, providing feedback again on how good your program is and ways in which it can be used. Now, trying to find out information about who's not using it, that becomes a much more difficult question. And so, how do you get information from non-information? But there's ways in which you can kind of track down perhaps people, but it would definitely be much harder. And finally, in our ethical issues, it's one of the biggest pieces here is to, how do we make sure that people are protected? How do we ensure anonymity? And so one of the ways is to have a larger sample. And so when you have a small sample, that can be, you might be able to put some, responses together to then see, and it's like, I know who answered that one. Especially when you have demographic data. A person who's 45 and, living in a particular zip code and is of a particular ethnicity, it may not take too much to find out who that person is. Um, so typically the rule of thumb is that in any, especially with federal data, you have to have at least 10 people within a given zip code, for any type of criteria. Otherwise, it becomes very easy to identify who they may be. So one of the ways in which we address that is with a larger sample, especially when we're using when we use pseudonyms for qualitative data. That's a way of protecting identities. Uh, Also using fewer text response boxes, because sometimes people will identify themselves through a situation that they knew. So, for instance, if you're writing about, giving feedback to a professor, and then you say, what, there was this issue in this instance that was going on, then I, as the professor, may remember that, and therefore know precisely who you are. So if you want to keep it anonymous, having fewer opportunities for that person to disclose who they are. And sometimes they'll even say, just note that you might be disclosing, who you are based on what you write. And then we also want to make sure that the data is always, kept locked. Usually, on a locked computer, in a secure server, these types of things to make sure then that this information doesn't get out. So that is a brief overview of surveys, and I hope that has been helpful. And I will see you in our next session. Thanks so much.